Welcome to the 5th episode in a legendary series about the Viking invasions. This episode, To the Ends of the Earth, focuses on how the Viking world was changed not just by the discovery of new lands, but the coming of a new religion, Christianity. We will be talking about the Danish settlers in Anglo-Saxon England, the rise of Christianity among the Norse in Scandinavia, the reign of Svyatoslav I, the last pagan prince of Kiev, and finally the Viking settlement of Greenland. While we often associate Vikings with death and destruction, their impact was much more complex. After the defeat of Erik Bloodaxe in 954, the Vikings no longer raided Anglo-Saxon England, but that didn't mean they left. After the great invasions of the 870s, Viking warlords had carved up Anglo-Saxon estates into small farms they gave their soldiers. Tens of thousands of Scandinavians migrated to England to work those farms, often draining marshes and clearing forests to bring new land under the plow. This created a vast part of northern England called the Danelaw, where Danish laws and customs prevailed, sometimes even after the Anglo-Saxon reconquest of the early 900s. These Danes remained as the pillars of society. Some Viking chieftains had made themselves earls or thanes, while more humble Vikings had become farmers, merchants, and tradesmen. The Danes in England often quickly converted to Christianity. Many did so for their own reasons. Self-made Viking lords wanted to make themselves more acceptable to their Anglo-Saxon subjects. Traders found they could get better prices if they wore a cross around their neck when they went into Anglo-Saxon towns. The first generation of Scandinavians usually just added Christ to the list of gods they worshipped, yet only one generation later, former Vikings were burying their dead with no pagan grave goods and under stone crosses. On top of that, the Scandinavians in England changed their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. Anglo-Saxons began adopting Norse-style art, clothing, and even hairstyles. But one of the biggest change was to language. Many of the town names in northern England are Danish in origin, usually with the Anglo-Saxon suffix ton, meaning town, with a Danish prefix, and that is how we get English town names like Skipton and Clapton. The Danes also contributed words to the English language like thing, strike, keel, kid, they, and mire. But it wasn't just words being shared. Christianity found its way from England to Scandinavia. About 150 years of raiding and trading meant that some Viking chiefs back in Scandinavia had become very rich and could even call themselves kings, credibly. One such king was Harald Bluetooth, who first unified Denmark under his rule, then conquered parts of southern Norway and Sweden. Harald got his name from a rotten tooth in his jaw, which had a bluish-black color. And he got a new religion after the Holy Roman Emperor waged a 10-year crusade against Denmark aimed at forcing them to accept Christianity. To end the war, Harald Bluetooth accepted baptism as a Christian. However, in doing so, he set himself against most of his subjects in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, many of whom remained pagan. They worshipped a collection of deities known as the Aesir and the Vanir. The Aesir were the primary gods, ruled by the wise one-eyed Odin and the mighty thunder god Thor. The Vanir were fertility gods, a subclass within the Aesir. However, Harald saw Christianity as a way to strengthen his lordship and help to unite his realm under a common faith. To help Christianity along, Harald Bluetooth took a midway approach. The temples were left to the pagans, but churches were built alongside them. These early Norse churches were modeled on longships, towering structures with dragon heads looming high in the sky. Though Harald personally refused to sacrifice to the gods, he also refused to punish those who continued to practice paganism in private, and by this approach he helped to bring Christianity to Scandinavia. However, far to the east, there was still one Viking warlord who held fast to the old ways. The Kievan Rus, the early Russian state founded by Viking explorers who started off building trading posts and then created princedoms, came under the rule of Svyatoslav I in the 960s. Though Svyatoslav was the first of his Viking dynasty with a Slavic rather than a Norse name, he remained a Viking. Even though Svyatoslav's mother Olga was a Christian, Svyatoslav refused to have anything to do with Christianity, instead building temples to and sacrificing to Odin and Thor. In fact, Svyatoslav's army functioned much like a Norse warband, but it didn't include men from Scandinavia, but rather all the nations of southern Europe, like the Drevlians, Polian, Severians, and the Radomics. After coming to power in 963, the 21-year-old Svyatoslav decided to put that warband to good use. He left his mother Olga in charge of Kiev and then headed to the Don River, crushing the Khazars. And in the decade that followed, Svyatoslav won more victories against the Vatachi in the Volga River Valley. By 970, he had more than doubled the size of Kiev and made himself the ruler of the largest state in Europe. So how did he do it? Much like the Vikings of Normandy, Svyatoslav reinvented Viking warfare. He remade his warband as a force of horsemen, and for land journeys, Svyatoslav's men herded cattle along with them so they wouldn't be burdened with wagons prone to getting stuck in the mud. They would cut up horse flesh and beef into thin strips and then heat them over hot coals. Rather than waste space and time with tents, his men covered themselves with horse blankets and used their saddles as pillows. This fast-moving army of mounted men could strike hard and fast across the Russian steppe. The East Roman Empire must have noticed Svyatoslav's victories because in the year 970, Emperor John of the East Roman Empire offered Svyatoslav 4,000 pounds of silver to help him reclaim land in the Balkan Peninsula taken by the Bulgars. Happily accepting, Svyatoslav headed into the Balkans to crush the Bulgars. In just a couple of years of warfare, Svyatoslav took 80 towns. But rather than return the conquered land to the East Romans, Svyatoslav decided to stay there. He even built a new capital on what was technically Eastern Roman territory. Emperor John then switched tactics, and instead paid a silver ransom to the Pecheneg nation to invade Kiev from the east. And in the year 972, Svyatoslav got a letter from his mother Olga telling him that if he didn't come back to Kiev soon, he wouldn't have a princedom. And as Svyatoslav traveled along the Dnieper River, he was ambushed by the Pecheneg Khan and had his head cut off. To add insult to injury, the Pecheneg Khan then sliced off the top of Svyatoslav's skull, lined the inside with silver, added a stem, and made it into a drinking cup. From that day on, whenever a Rus ambassador came to the Pecheneg court, they had to drink a toast from the skull of their former emperor. And Emperor John was likely pleased with himself and must have only become more pleased when the Kievan Rus fell into civil war between the three sons of Svyatoslav. By the time the dust settled, two of the brothers were dead and the sole survivor Vladimir became prince. Vladimir would make a clear break with his Viking roots, embracing Eastern Orthodox Christianity to unite his polyglot princedom, much as Harold Bluetooth used Christianity to unite his Scandinavian kingdom. And if you were a Viking who was looking to take land without war, you would have to follow Erik the Red west. Erik the Red was born in Norway around 950. When he was only 10 years old, his father was exiled after committing murder, and the family had to flee to Iceland. Following in his father's footsteps, Erik married, became a farmer, and then started feuding with his neighbors. Around 982, Erik murdered one of his neighbors and was exiled from Iceland for 3 years. At first, he traveled to an island off the coast of the British Isles, but within a matter of months had murdered a second neighbor in a second feud. Erik the Red then decided that he needed to find a country with no laws and no neighbors. So he packed his family into a longship and thought about some stories he'd heard as a boy in Iceland about a huge island to the northwest of Iceland. He followed the route that was described and eventually came across the world's largest island, Greenland. During his 3-year exile in Greenland, Erik the Red learned 2 things. Number 1, Greenland was a very harsh and very cold place to live. Number 2, he learned that there was much money to be made there by hunting. However, number 2 led him to a third lesson that he was going to have to get some neighbors. It was simply too harsh and too cold in Greenland for his family to survive on their own. So in 985, he packed his family up in the longship and headed home to Iceland. Like shady realtors have done throughout history, Erik the Red decided to drum up interest in his new country by giving it a catchy name, Greenland. And his tales of lush and verdant valleys that were just aching for the plow probably helped to get people interested in Greenland, but the simple fact was that Iceland just wasn't the raw frontier it had once been. A century ago, Scandinavians had been flocking to Iceland in the hopes of carving farms out of a raw wilderness, but by 985, the island had become overpopulated. On top of that, wealthy families had risen to power, keeping the best land in Iceland for themselves, while the poor scratched out a living on shrinking farms. And if the poor man hoped for justice from the Althing, Iceland's democratic assembly, they were out of luck. The Althing, the lawmaking body of Iceland, had fallen under the influence of powerful families who bent the law to serve their own interests. So Erik the Red did not have much trouble putting together an expedition of 500 people to help him populate Greenland. Unfortunately, Greenland did not live up to its name. About 75% of the island's surface was covered by inland ice, which collided with more slabs of drift ice floating along the coasts. Glaciers and mountains made it impossible to explore inland. Its mostly Arctic climate saw temperatures rarely rise above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and they could often sink below negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet Greenland still had places to live. These first Norse settled in the few green pockets along the southwestern coast of Greenland. Yet even these coastal enclaves offered few chances to grow grain. To survive, these early settlers grazed livestock brought from Iceland and hunted marine life such as seals and caribou for meat. However, the Norse hadn't come all this way just to survive, they wanted to make money. So they undertook fishing trips of hundreds of miles to places like Disco Bay to hunt polar bears, narwhals, and walruses, often with little more than harpoons, lances, and hooks. However, these animals were what made the Greenland Vikings their money, especially the walrus. They shipped walrus ivory back home to Europe, where they were used for church engravings and elaborate chess pieces. In return, Europe sent amber, tin, iron, and furs, so that the Greenland Norse weren't just surviving, they were living in style. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comment section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.